The day started quietly, almost too quietly for the small-town square where people were used to the usual sounds of life. There were voices, footsteps, the distant hum of a car or two passing by, and the occasional bark of a dog. But in one corner of the square, near the old stone fountain, a piano sat alone. It was not new, but it was cared for. Its black and white keys gleamed softly under the morning sun. It was as if the piano was waiting, not impatiently, but patiently, for someone who would truly see it. The woman walked slowly toward the piano. She did not rush. Her steps were careful, almost hesitant. She wore simple clothes, something ordinary that blended with the crowd rather than stood out. Her hair was tied back in a plain ponytail, and she carried no bag or sheet music. She had only herself and her hands. As she approached, people began to notice. Not everyone, just a few who happened to glance up from their conversations or from checking their phones. Some whispered to each other. Some smirked. There was an unspoken curiosity, mixed with doubt. In their eyes, the woman stopped a few steps from the piano and looked at it. She did not touch it at once. She studied the keys as if they held a secret she had to discover. A gentle breeze stirred, and the faint smell of flowers from the fountain mixed with the soft notes of the town around her. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs. The sound of distant laughter from children playing in the square reached her ears, but she did not move. She was gathering herself, readying for something that the world did not yet understand. People began to gather slowly, almost instinctively. Some were curious. Others were bored and looking for a distraction. A few lingered, leaning against the edges of the fountain, hands in pockets, watching the woman with a mixture of expectation and amusement. She looked small in comparison to the piano. She looked ordinary. Nothing about her suggested that she would do anything remarkable. That was part of what made the moment so fragile, like a candle flame in a drafty room. She placed her hands gently on the keys, not pressing, just resting them lightly as if introducing herself to an old friend. Her fingers trembled slightly. A few of the onlookers whispered to each other and one or two stifled laughter. It was a natural reaction. The woman seemed so nervous, so unsure, that it was almost comical to see someone take such care in a simple action. The piano was large, black, and elegant, and she was small and ordinary. In their eyes, it seemed like a mismatch, and they could not imagine how it could possibly work. She glanced at the people who were watching, then looked back at the piano. She knew they were judging her. She knew they expected her to fail. She knew that any mistake would only confirm their assumptions. But she did not move away. She did not give up. She took another deep breath, letting it calm her racing heart. Her fingers hovered over the keys, feeling the cool surface under her skin. The piano was silent, waiting, patient, ready. And in that silence, she found a kind of courage that was quiet but strong. She pressed one key, slowly, softly. It made a sound that was not perfect, not beautiful, but it was honest. The crowd shifted. Some looked at each other, eyebrows raised. Some laughed quietly. It was not cruel laughter, but it was laughter of surprise, of curiosity, of disbelief. They did not yet know what was coming. They only saw a small, nervous woman and a piano. She pressed another key. This one sounded better, though still not like music that would fill a concert hall. She was careful, testing, feeling, learning. The fingers that had trembled now began to move with a quiet confidence, small but noticeable. She did not rush. She did not try to impress. She simply let her hands connect with the piano, letting it guide her. The music, tentative at first, started to emerge. A few more people had gathered. Now there were whispers, not of ridicule, but of curiosity. People leaned forward slightly. Some stopped scrolling on their phones. They were paying attention, even if they did not know why. The woman's face was calm, focused, her eyes on the keys. But there was a flicker of something in her expression, hope, perhaps, or a quiet determination. The piano had become more than an object. It was a partner, and together they were beginning to communicate. She played a small melody, simple, almost childlike in its innocence. but there was something in it that reached beyond the simplicity. It was delicate, but it had feeling. It was unpolished, but it had honesty. She closed her eyes as she played, letting the sound guide her. The world around her faded. The whispers, the laughter, the doubts, they all disappeared into the background. There was only the piano and the woman, and the soft notes that began to fill the square. Some in the crowd started to notice. The laughter had faded slightly. Eyes widened as the notes grew more confident, more deliberate. There was a rhythm to her playing, a pattern that seemed to belong not just to the music, but to her very being. People felt it without knowing why. There was no sheet music, no rehearsed performance, only the connection between a human being and an instrument that had waited for someone like her. A breeze moved through the square again, carrying the soft, tentative notes. A child paused in their play, listening. A man walking his dog stopped, letting the leash slack in his hands. Even the older woman sitting on the edge of the fountain lifted her head, curious. Something was happening, something that no one expected. The piano, once silent and ordinary, was beginning to speak, and the person at its keys was its translator. The woman did not notice the crowd growing. She did not play for applause or attention. She played because it was part of her, because it was necessary, because it filled a space inside her that words could not reach. Every note was a piece of herself that she offered to the world. And even though the world had not yet fully understood, even though some still laughed quietly to themselves, the music had begun to change the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She paused for a moment, letting the last note linger. Silence fell, and in that silence, the piano seemed to breathe with her. The people who had gathered shifted, uncertain of what to do. The child blinked. The man with the dog frowned, confused. The older woman leaned forward slightly. No one spoke, but the air was different now. It held expectation, a feeling that something more was about to happen. The woman took another breath and placed her fingers back on the keys, ready to continue, ready to explore, ready to let the piano and herself tell a story that no one yet knew the ending of. It was a beginning. Not perfect, not grand, but a beginning. And in that beginning, the ordinary world of a small town square was about to be quietly, irrevocably changed by the courage of one person, a piano, and the music that had waited for them both. The air in the square had changed slightly. It was still calm, still quiet in many ways, but there was a new energy. It's almost like electricity running unseen through the crowd. People who had been talking or passing by slowed down. They began to notice not just the piano, but the woman playing it. Her fingers moved more confidently now, gliding over the keys in a rhythm that was gentle but deliberate. The music had a soft charm, something that made the ordinary square feel different, as if it had been lifted out of time for a few moments. Some people smiled, curious. Others exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. And then it happened. A person near the edge of the crowd chuckled, lightly at first, a small, almost polite laugh. But that laugh, for some reason, spread. Others joined in, quietly at first, then louder. The sound was not cruel, but it was laughter nonetheless. They laughed at the contrast they saw, a small, nervous woman, her simple clothes, the way she had hesitated at the keys just moments ago. To them, it seemed funny that she was trying to play, that she believed she could make something beautiful. The woman heard it. She had to hear it. At first, it stung, a little like a cold breeze across her skin. Her shoulders tensed, her fingers froze briefly on the keys. The laughter was not meant to be mean, and yet it was hard to ignore. Some of the onlookers laughed softly into their hands, hiding their smiles. A few even pointed at her, whispering to each other. Her heart beat faster, not from the music, but from the sudden self-consciousness that gripped her. For a moment she thought about leaving. She could stand, step away, pretend she had never come. But she did not. She stayed. She took a slow, deep breath and reminded herself why she had come here. Why she had walked across the square with no music sheet and no expectation except to play. It was not for them. It was for herself. And that thought, small but steady, allowed her fingers to move again gently over the keys. She started slowly, testing herself, feeling out the piano's response. The music returned, fragile at first, but with purpose. The crowd noticed the change. The laughter faltered, became uncertain. Some people stopped mid-chuckle and looked more closely. The melody was different now, not hurried, not trying to impress, but deliberate. It carried a softness that made them pause. The keys sang beneath her fingers, and though the music was still simple, there was something in it that spoke to more than the ears. It spoke to attention, to curiosity, to the idea that someone was here to create something real. A young man leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, watching intently. He had been skeptical, had laughed himself, but now he was quiet. Something about the sincerity of the performance made him feel uncomfortable in a strange way, as if he had judged too quickly. Nearby, a small child tugged at their parent's sleeve, pointing toward the piano with wide eyes. The parent followed the child's gaze and paused. The music was not grand or perfect, but it was alive. It had a pulse, a heartbeat that matched the small movements of the crowd around it. The woman's confidence grew as she played. Her fingers pressed the keys with a steadier rhythm. She began to use more of the keyboard, exploring the higher notes, then moving into the deeper tones. The music began to weave in patterns, small arcs of melody that rose and fell, creating moments of tension and release. Even without a formal structure or sheet music, she guided the piano as if it were an extension of herself. Each note had intention, and it began to demand attention. The laughter that had started so easily now sounded awkward. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Their assumptions were being challenged quietly but firmly. A few whispered to each other, almost apologetically. "She's actually good," one murmured. "I didn't expect this," said another. The music, unassuming and simple, was changing their perception before they even realized it. The woman herself did not rush or try to prove anything. She played naturally, letting the piano do the speaking. Some people started to record on their phones, not to capture a funny moment, but because they felt it was important, interesting, worth remembering. A man sitting on the steps of the fountain leaned forward, elbows on knees, listening intently. Even the breeze seemed to settle around her, carrying the sound gently through the square. The piano, once just an object of curiosity, had become central, a voice that could not be ignored. Her hands moved faster now, though with control, creating flowing passages that mixed simple harmonies with small, unexpected twists. The music was not complex, but it was sincere. It had emotion, and that made it powerful. The woman's face remained calm, but a small smile appeared as she noticed the subtle shift in the crowd's reaction. She had almost doubted herself, almost let the laughter stop her, but now she felt a quiet triumph. Not for herself alone, but for the music that had managed to speak above the doubts. The crowd continued to grow, as more people paused in the square to listen. Some had walked by without paying attention, but now they stopped. Some whispered to each other, pointing at the piano. Others stood silently, letting the music wash over them. Even those who had laughed earlier now found it hard to keep the amusement in their voices. The sound was too gentle, too real, too human for laughter to survive for long. It demanded a kind of respect. The woman's playing became more expressive. She leaned slightly forward, letting her body sway with the rhythm. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, moving with confidence, with precision. She closed her eyes as she played certain notes, letting herself feel the music rather than think it. The piano responded to her touch, and in return, the music filled the square, carrying with it the story of hesitation, courage, and quiet determination. An older man in the crowd, someone who had seen many performers in his life, nodded slowly. He had arrived expecting a simple morning walk, perhaps a brief distraction. Instead, he felt the music touching him in ways that were unexpected. The notes were not perfect, but they were real. They carried emotion. They carried effort. They carried the unmistakable signature of a person who had taken a risk to share something deeply personal, the child who had tugged at the parents. Sleeve now sat cross-legged on the pavement, listening intently. Every now and then, the child's eyes widened in surprise as the melody swelled and fell. The parent, too, was captivated, leaning forward, mouth slightly open, forgetting for a moment the routines and worries of everyday life. The music was doing something rare. It was holding attention effortlessly, changing the mood of the people around it. The woman noticed none of this directly. She was immersed in the piano, in the connection between her hands and the keys. Each note was deliberate. Each chord was carefully placed. She was aware of the space around her only in the sense that it allowed the sound to travel, allowed it to be heard, allowed it to be felt. She was playing for the music itself. That purity of purpose was beginning to radiate outward. Some of the onlookers whispered to each other about how quickly their perception had changed. "I thought she was just nervous," one said. "I didn't expect." This said another. They were silent more often now, letting the music do the speaking. A few faces reflected surprise, a few reflected admiration, and a few were simply still, caught in a moment they had not anticipated. The woman, small and unassuming, was quietly commanding the attention of the square. The piano's sound had grown richer. She was exploring deeper tones, using the lower keys to add weight to the melody. Her fingers moved with growing assurance, weaving the higher notes into delicate patterns that contrasted beautifully with the depth of the lower sounds. The music was no longer hesitant. It was a story, a narrative told through sound, rising and falling, catching the attention and curiosity of everyone present. Even those who had laughed hardest in the beginning were quiet now. The melody was impossible to ignore. It created a space where doubt and ridicule could not enter. It was not loud or overpowering, but it was compelling. Every note carried meaning, and those who listened began to feel it. Their expressions changed. Their laughter was gone. They were listening. They were learning that first impressions could be wrong, that courage and sincerity could speak louder than mockery. The woman's smile became a little more visible, though still subtle. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not from impressing anyone, but from the realization that the music was working, that it was touching people. She continued to play carefully, naturally, letting each note find its place. The piano, once just an object in a square, had become a bridge between her and everyone around her. It was a moment of shared humanity, fragile yet strong. She played until the morning sun had climbed higher, letting light fall across the keys and illuminate her hands. Every person in the crowd had shifted in some way, moved by the music whether they realized it or not. And as she pressed the final note of her little passage, the square seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next moment, the next phrase, the next revelation that this unassuming woman and her piano had yet to deliver. The morning light warmed the square gently. With it, the mood began to shift. The woman's fingers moved steadily over the keys, her touch more confident than before. Each note seemed to carry a message that went beyond music. It was as if the piano itself had become a storyteller, and she was only its instrument. The crowd, which had been a mixture of curiosity and laughter, began to feel a subtle change. The laughter had completely disappeared now, replaced by an almost invisible tension, a feeling of anticipation. People leaned forward slightly, listening more closely, as if the next note might reveal a secret they could not yet understand. The woman did not notice them in the conventional way. She did not glance at their faces, nor did she play for them. She played for the sound itself, letting it fill the space around her. The keys responded to her touch, producing tones that were both delicate and firm. She moved between registers smoothly, sometimes high, sometimes low, exploring the piano's range. Each note connected to the next in a way that felt natural, as though the piano had been waiting for her hands for years. A young man who had arrived late to the square leaned against a nearby wall. At first, he had joined the laughter, but as he listened, his eyes widened. He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief at the skill, but in wonder at the courage it must have taken to sit here in front of strangers and play with such sincerity. Another person, an older woman sitting on a bench with her bag on her lap, felt her heart beat slow, her mind calming as she listened. The music seemed to touch something deep within her, something she had forgotten existed amidst her daily routines. The melody became more intricate, not complex in the way of classical music, but layered in emotion. It was a conversation, a journey, a story told without words. The woman's hands moved faster now, but each note was measured precise. There was a rhythm to her playing that felt organic, almost like breathing. The crowd, sensing this, grew still. They stopped whispering, stopped shifting in their positions. They were listening entirely, letting the music carry them along. A child, who had been fidgeting earlier, now sat cross-legged on the pavement, staring at the piano in fascination. Every so often, their small hand would mimic the movement of her fingers. Nearby, a man with a notebook, who had been doodling absent-mindedly, now stopped. He lifted his pen, not to write, but to pay attention. The music had captured him. Even those who had been skeptical moments ago could not deny the feeling it evoked, a mix of calm and curiosity. A sense of witnessing something rare and delicate. The woman leaned slightly forward, pressing the keys with renewed energy. There was a smile forming, subtle and private, as she felt the music flow from her mind to her fingers to the piano. She did not need to see the crowd. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the silence around her was no longer empty, but full of expectation. The music had begun to change the space, turning ordinary stones, benches, and people into something like an audience in a quiet theater. A group of teenagers who had been tossing a ball nearby stopped playing. The ball rolled to a stop, forgotten, as they watched her hands move over the keys. One whispered to the other, It's actually good." Another nodded, unable to speak. They had expected a mistake, perhaps even a comical one, but what they were seeing now was skill, courage, and sincerity. The melody had transformed their laughter into respect without a single word being spoken. The woman's hands moved more freely now. She began to add small variations, a pause here, a gentle emphasis there. She experimented with tempo, letting some phrases linger and others rush lightly. It was not technical mastery she displayed, but understanding, intuition. She understood how to make each note matter, how to create a tension that would release naturally. The piano, once a silent object, was now alive. Speaking through her hands, a man standing nearby with a camera lowered it slowly. He had been filming, thinking the moment might be amusing, but now he paused. He realized the camera could not capture what he was hearing, what he was feeling. The emotion in the music was deeper than any recording could convey. It was subtle, quiet, and human. Something about that moment, that connection between the woman and the piano, was transforming the square into something more than just a gathering of people. The melody began to evolve further. She added small flourishes, delicate touches that drew the listener in. It was not flashy or showy, but it was captivating. Each note carried intention, purpose, and emotion. The crowd, now fully engaged, felt a quiet admiration. They had laughed before, yes, but that laughter had melted away in the face of something real, something human, something that could not be ignored. A mother standing near the fountain held her child closer, as if the music was a story she wanted to share in the silence between notes. An elderly man, leaning on his cane, closed his eyes. The weight of his years, the noise of his life seemed to lift for a few moments. The piano was not just producing sound. It was shaping the atmosphere, bending it gently toward calm and attention. The woman's presence, her focus, and her sincerity were central to that transformation. She began to play a small, ascending series of notes, rising like a gentle wave. Then she let it fall slowly, descending in a pattern that felt natural, inevitable. The square was quiet now, except for the music. Even the breeze seemed to pause. The notes stretched across the space, touching the corners of the square, flowing into the ears and hearts of everyone present. People were leaning in slightly, eyes wide, paying attention in a way that few had expected. The woman's expression remained calm, almost serene. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that was both deliberate and fluid. She was not performing for applause. She was not performing for approval. She was communicating with the piano, and through it, with the people around her. That communication was being received, understood, and felt. The laughter of before was a distant memory, replaced by attention and wonder. A young man in the crowd, arms crossed, finally let them fall to his sides. He had laughed first, but now he watched intently, the corners of his mouth softening. He realized that he had underestimated the courage it took to do this, to play in front of strangers without expectation of praise. The music was teaching a quiet lesson. Sincerity and courage could be far more moving than skill alone. And she had both, quietly, without arrogance or flash. The woman continued to play, exploring the higher keys now, letting them trill lightly in a way that felt like sunlight filtering through leaves. The lower keys provided a grounding balance, a steady, reassuring pulse beneath the delicate upper tones. The combination created harmony not just in sound, but in the energy of the space. People felt it instinctively. It was as if the piano had become a mirror, reflecting something true about courage, vulnerability, and presence. The child on the pavement smiled slightly, eyes glued to the piano. The mother watched silently, a tear forming in the corner of her eye. The older woman on the bench shifted slightly, a smile appearing, small and subtle, but genuine. The young man who had leaned against the wall earlier felt his skepticism melt. All at once, the crowd's reaction was transforming, and the woman, absorbed in her music, was unaware of the magnitude of that change. The music became more expressive, more alive. She paused occasionally, letting a note linger, letting the resonance settle. Every pause, every slight change in tempo added meaning. The audience responded subconsciously, leaning closer, tilting heads, eyes following the movement of her hands. They were learning to listen differently, to allow themselves to feel rather than judge. The piano and the woman were guiding them. A soft murmur spread across a few in the crowd. Not of laughter, but of amazement. "I didn't expect this," one whispered. Another shook their head, smiling softly. The music had shifted the mood completely. What had begun as light amusement and laughter had become quiet reverence. The woman, with her humble presence and honest playing, had begun to transform not just the sound in the square, but the people within it. She continued, her focus absolute. The morning sun moved across the square, casting gentle shadows, but she did not notice. She was fully immersed in the flow of the music, letting each note guide the next. The piano responded, and in response, the people listened. The change in the crowd was evident. They were no longer casual observers. They were witnesses to something small yet profound, something ordinary becoming extraordinary through dedication and heart. The melody began to slow slightly, gentle waves rolling across the keys. The woman's expression softened. There was a quiet joy in her playing, a sense of sharing that was unspoken but deeply felt. The crowd, too, felt it in their posture, in their attention, in the way the square had grown still, except for the music itself. Laughter was gone. Curiosity had transformed into respect. Skepticism had turned into quiet admiration. A man who had been walking by stopped completely. He had planned only a brief pause, but the music held him. He tilted his head, letting the melody wash over him. Each note seemed to remind him of something he had forgotten in his life, a small spark of connection, of feeling, of presence. The piano, and the woman playing it, had become a conduit for something deeply human, something that did not need words to be understood. As she finished the small section of music, she let the last note linger in the air. It hung there, fragile, echoing softly, almost reluctant to leave. The crowd remained silent, holding their collective breath. The moment was delicate, yet it carried power. The piano had spoken. The woman had communicated something true. The square, once ordinary, was now a space of shared experience, of emotion, of understanding. In that silence, the woman took a slow breath, ready to continue. She had reached a point where the music was no longer just her on it, belonged to the space, to the people, to the shared energy of attention and emotion. And as she prepared for the next series of notes, it was clear that the first real change at Oath Square had grown quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The soft murmur of the early morning had disappeared entirely, leaving only the gentle sound of the piano as it spoke across the open space. The woman's hands moved with grace and intention, no longer hesitant, no longer small. Every note she played carried meaning, and the crowd had become silent. each person suspended in a moment they had not expected, experiencing a sense of connection they could not fully explain. The music now had a depth that seemed to reach into every corner of the square. She had begun exploring dynamics, letting some notes rise softly, others fall more heavily, like a conversation that spoke both in whispers and in declarations. It was clear to those watching that she was not playing from sheet music, nor was she attempting to impress anyone. This was music that came from inside her, music that had lived with her, waiting for the moment when it could finally be heard. The child, who had been cross-legged on the pavement, had leaned forward further, hands on knees, eyes wide. The little face reflected wonder and concentration, showing that even at a young age, the power of music could touch something deep and instinctive. The parent holding the child felt their own breath catch, realizing how profoundly simple sound could influence the heart. Every note seemed to carry intention, empathy, and courage. The woman moved seamlessly across the keyboard, alternating between delicate trills and richer, more resonant chords. She added small pauses that made each phrase linger, inviting the audience to feel the silence as much as the sound. The music's ebb and flow seemed natural, unforced, as though she had been born knowing how to balance these quiet surges of emotion. Even the people who had laughed at first were now completely absorbed. Some leaned slightly forward, some tilted their heads, and a few even closed their eyes, letting the notes sink fully into their awareness. An elderly man who had come to the square for a short morning walk found himself rooted in place. He had been skeptical, thinking that music from a piano in a public space would be nothing more than background noise. But the woman's playing drew him in. Each chord seemed to tell a story. Each trill suggested a feeling he could relate to. He realized that skill and courage, combined with honesty, could transform even the simplest melodies into something extraordinary. The melody became more complex, not in a technical sense, but in an emotional one. She began layering her sounds, using both hands in harmony to build tension and release it with subtle shifts. The piano's resonance spread across the square, touching those at the edges as well as those closest to the instrument. It was a sound that demanded attention without demanding anything else. A sound that held no judgment, only presence. People who had walked by initially were now stopping. They came slowly, almost cautiously, unsure what was happening but drawn by something irresistible. They slowed their steps, allowed themselves to feel the music, and became part of the shared experience. The woman's playing had created an invisible thread that connected everyone present. A shared moment of human experience made tangible through sound. The woman herself was fully immersed. Her eyes were half closed, her body moving slightly with the rhythm, but her focus remained on the keys. She was not performing. She was expressing, allowing the piano to be an extension of her thoughts and emotions. There was a rhythm to her fingers that was both disciplined and free, structured yet spontaneous. The music was alive, breathing with each motion, each press, each gentle release. A young man who had initially laughed the hardest now stood with his hands in his pockets, a soft expression on his face. He could not stop watching. The confidence and honesty in her playing had drawn him in. He felt a deep respect for someone who had faced potential ridicule and turned it into a moment of connection. He realized that courage could be far more powerful than any technical skill alone. The melody began to swell, rising and falling with waves of emotion. She added subtle flourishes, delicate accents that seemed almost like spoken words woven into the music. The crowd felt these waves without needing to analyze them. The music carried meaning in a language older than words. People shifted slightly, leaning in unconsciously, hearts beating in rhythm with the quiet power of her playing. A soft breeze carried the sound through the square, rustling leaves, brushing past faces, and adding a sense of life to the moment. Birds perched nearby seemed to pause, as if listening to. The environment itself had become part of the performance, silent witnesses to the unfolding connection. Every person in the square, from the young child to the elderly observer, felt a change within themselves, subtle but undeniable. The woman's fingers now danced lightly over the higher keys, producing a shimmering sound that contrasted beautifully with the deeper tones she had used earlier. She shifted seamlessly between ranges, blending the high and low in a way that created harmony not just in sound but in feeling. Each phrase she played invited listeners to experience a spectrum of emotions: curiosity, anticipation, calm, and awe. Even those who had been recording the scene on their phones now lowered them. They realized that a screen could never fully capture what they were experiencing. The moment was too human, too fragile, and too alive. The music, the woman's presence, and the audience's attention had created something far beyond documentation had shared: human connection. The woman allowed a particular chord to linger longer, its resonance filling the space in a way that almost seemed to touch the hearts of those listening. People exhaled slowly, unconsciously, as though the music had led them to release tension they had not realized they were holding. The square had transformed into a temporary sanctuary, a place where only honesty, vulnerability, and expression mattered. A group of teenagers who had been skeptical earlier now whispered softly to each other, unable to hide their admiration. Their eyes followed her fingers, watching the subtle movements, the ease with which she navigated the keys, and the emotion that accompanied each note. They had expected humor, entertainment, or a casual performance, but what they witnessed was far more profound. They felt a quiet awe, an acknowledgement that the woman's courage and sincerity had created something meaningful. The music grew richer, deeper, with layers that suggested stories within stories. She incorporated pauses and repetitions that gave the audience time to reflect, to internalize what they were hearing. Each person experienced it differently, but all were affected. Some smiled softly, others leaned forward, some closed their eyes. The square, once ordinary and filled with casual noise, had become a space for contemplation, empathy, and shared emotion. The child on the pavement gently clapped at the end of a small passage, eyes wide with wonder. The parents smiled, allowing themselves a quiet moment of joy. The older woman on the bench nodded slightly, feeling the emotion ripple through her. The young man who had been skeptical now watched with respect and curiosity. Even the elderly man with the cane, who had paused in surprise, found himself moved by the simple, yet powerful expression of the woman's music. Her hands now moved fluidly across the keys, creating patterns that were at once simple and emotionally resonant. She explored delicate contrasts, from soft whispers of sound to slightly louder, fuller chords that created tension and release. The audience felt this ebb and flow intuitively, each note guiding them further into the experience. The music was alive, and it carried the stories of courage, sincerity, and human connection without a single word being spoken. The woman's concentration never wavered. She was fully absorbed in the moment, yet she sensed the change in the crowd. Their attention was no longer casual. It was engaged, present, and full of unspoken admiration. She did not seek recognition, applause, or praise. The music itself was her expression, and the response of the audience was a natural outcome of honesty meeting openness. The melody became even more expressive, exploring emotional peaks and gentle valleys. Her fingers moved with precision and care, each note deliberate. The high and low tones intertwined, creating a rich tapestry of sound that enveloped the square. People instinctively leaned closer, feeling the resonance, allowing themselves to be part of the story being told without words. A man standing near the fountain, who had arrived late, paused completely, drawn in by the unfolding music. He felt something shift within him, an unexpected reminder of past emotions, hopes, and memories. The piano under the woman's hands had become a conduit for universal human feelings. She was sharing a piece of herself, and the audience was receiving it fully. Without reservation, the music now had a rhythm that seemed to mimic breathing, a gentle inhalation and exhalation that carried the audience along. Every pause, every accent, every subtle change in tempo was noticed and felt. The woman had transformed the ordinary square into a place of reflection, empathy, and silent communication. The audience, fully attentive, was caught in the delicate power of human expression through music. As she reached a particularly resonant chord, the last notes lingered in the air, carrying weight and meaning. The square was still, but the energy had shifted profoundly. The audience had become part of the music's narrative, and the music had become part of their experience. The woman took a slow breath, her hands poised above the keys, ready to continue. Fully aware that something remarkable had begun to unfold, a transformation of perception, a shared human connection, and a quiet reverence that could not be ignored. The air in the square was heavy with anticipation. The woman's fingers moved with quiet confidence across the keys, each note carefully placed, yet flowing effortlessly into the next. She had reached a point where the music was no longer simply melodies or harmonies. It had become a story, a conversation, a message that touched the hearts of everyone present. The crowd, once filled with whispers and laughter, now stood in complete silence, absorbed fully in the sound that seemed to resonate not just in their ears, but in their very beings. The melody rose and fell like gentle waves, carrying emotion with every note. She played with intention, letting each chord linger long enough for the audience to feel it, then releasing it naturally. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was an extension of herself, and through it, she shared her courage, her vulnerability, and her unwavering dedication to something she loved deeply. The people watching could feel it, a subtle warmth spreading through the square, touching each listener in its own way.